Great. So welcome everyone. I'm Scott Podolsky, one of the organizers of the series, Social Medicine Symposia, in honor of the 150th anniversary of our department, from its formation as the Department of Hygiene in 1871 through today. Those who attended our first symposium in September may recall that the first HMS professor of hygiene, George Derby, set several important precedents. First, he focused attention on the direct relationship between environmental conditions and the health of the populace. Second, and critically, he turned his attention to the importance of equity in the distribution of health measures, and in particular, to society's responsibility for the alleviation of detrimental and uneven environmental conditions. By the early 20th century, as the Department of Hygiene became the Department of Preventive Medicine, such obligations have become framed in terms of, quote, justice, as opposed to, quote, charity. And by the late 20th and early 21st centuries, errors of our Department of Social Medicine and then Global Health and Social Medicine, such concerns with equity moved ever more centrally to the core of the department's mission and activities, embodied in its teaching, its research, and its close affiliation with partners in health and the provision of care to those who need it most. Still more recently, and harkening back in many ways to Derby himself, members of our department have again combined such concerns with equity, with those focused on the direct relationship between the environment and human health. But they've come a long way from Derby, informing such concerns and analysis with perspectives not only of biomedicine, but of history, anthropology, and political economy to describe the health effects of climate change, the forces shaping the inequitable distribution of its impacts, and potential measures to offset such forces. Along these lines, three of today's speakers, Maxine Burkett, Eugene Richardson, and Paul Farmer, have authored the first chapter on the health effects of climate change ever written for Harrison's Principles of Internal Medicine, after 70 years and 20 editions of the venerable volume. Along with our fourth speaker, Jason Hickel, they likewise worked on climate reparations and redistributive justice as part of the larger Lancet Commission on Reparations, co-chaired by Dr. Richardson. In this way, they continue to position our department to inform our school's approach to the most pressing health concerns that face us today. Along these lines, we have a wonderful program this afternoon, engaging with climate justice and degrowth. After an introduction by our department chair, Paul Farmer, we hear from our esteemed speakers, Maxine Burkett and Jason Hickel, before moving on to discussion and Q&A moderated by Eugene Richardson. I get to introduce Paul Farmer. As I suspect most of our audience knows, Dr. Farmer, in addition to serving as the department chair, is the Cole Cutroni's University Professor here at Harvard, co-founder of Partners in Health, and chief of the Division of Global Health Equity at Brigham and Women's Hospital. His most recent book, Fevers, Feuds, and Diamonds, Ebola and the Ravages of History, serves as a model for examining the deep historical forces shaping current inequities, so he's particularly well positioned to introduce our speakers in the symposium. I'll turn it over to Paul at this time.
Well, I'm not so well positioned as Gene will be, and we're going to do this jointly. I just want to say, first of all, how proud and grateful we are that both Maxine and Jason are involved in this, and we've learned a number of things from them. Some of you have read Jason's work. He's the author of a successful and very lucid and readable book about how global inequities come to be, how they're maintained, how disparities mean that resources will continue to be funneled out of some places into others, often at the expense of any notion of public profit. Jason was born in Swaziland and raised there, and as I said, I'm going to let Gene do part of the introduction of their scholarly work. Again, really has served as a voice against some of these large-scale economic and political forces that promise misery to some and abundance to some few. So, Jason, thank you for being here with us. Maxine Burnett, we don't always allow lawyers into our midst, but Maxine Burnett is a professor of law at the University of Hawaii. But she has joined us and indeed led an effort even before her most recent post, which I'll leave Gene to describe, on the Lancet Commission that Gene himself has really organized as much as anyone, more than anyone. Maxine has not only engaged in critical scholarship about the notion of reparations and climate justice, but has been serving in an important policy role and has recently returned from the COP at Glasgow. So Jean, I'm going to ask you to add in a couple of things. And again, I want to say, Maxine and Jason, we hope to be seeing a lot more of you in our department, because you fill a space that none of us are able to occupy at this point. Although we're continuing learning from you and continuing to learn from you, and expect to learn a lot more over the coming years. Gene?
Thanks, Paul.
Did I get Burkett? He just wrote Burkett. Sorry, I've got Burkett's lymphoma on the brain.
Yeah, thanks so much, Paul. You know, it really is an honor to be in this position of, you know, figuring out who to bring into discussion for, you know, the existential crisis of our times. And I'm, you know, so grateful for you and Arthur and Byron and Mary Jo and, you know, all of the senior faculty over the years that have created this space. It's a very unique space in the world. As I've learned now that I've been presenting my book at various institutions, that, you know, there may be places called departments of social medicine, but you'd be very hard pressed to find ones that really bring together the service, teaching, and research in a critical way, like the house you've built for us. And so, when I thought about a presentation on climate change and environmental justice, I really couldn't ask for two better people in the entire world to come together, to synergize, to help us understand what things look like now, where we're going, what policy looks like, but what things could look like beyond, you know, what things could look like even more radically beyond what was agreed to just last month. And so it really is a great honor to bring these two together. And, you know, I become more of a relationalist over the years. And so I don't really see them as, you know, two individuals, but, you know, part of this brilliant network that is going to hopefully bring us safely into the future and protect our children's futures. And so I'm really looking forward to hearing them speak, and then there'll be plenty of time for discussion afterwards. But with that, I'd like to, did we decide which of you would like to go first? All right. So
You were supposed to decide, Gene.
Maxine, please take it away.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Jean and Paul. It's just been a pleasure working with both of you over the last couple of years. I can't believe it's only been about 2 years since we first met. It feels like much longer, to your point on relationships and this moment and this moment needing all of our good thinking. I'm actually just sort of drying off from the past few days of a pretty torrential rainstorm here in Honolulu, where we've seen some mudslides in our area, and you know, the sort of unprecedented impacts that are sort of animating our time. And it's a great opportunity to talk with you about what I think is sort of a longer story. And I'm here in Hawaii, which itself is a sort of a colonized space. And so I want to sort of bring that to this discussion as well. I'm going to dive right into the content here, first by sharing my screen. Please let me know if you have any trouble seeing the slides that are there. Are you seeing the image? Just, yeah, fantastic. Yeah, and I should jump right in, because in the next 30 or so minutes, I will attempt to span the globe in 5 centuries to sort of better understand issues of equity and justice in the context of climate change. But because the scope of climate justice itself is so is quite massive, I'll use the challenge of human mobility and climate-induced migration, which is another area of my research, to animate that broader work in climate justice. And that work that I've done my entire time in the Legal Academy has been sort of built on a few interlinked propositions that will continue to drive my work. And it's also part of Root and Branch, which itself is a commentary in the Harvard Law Review Forum published earlier this year. But here are just sort of 2 of the propositions that inform the work. The first is that racism and racial hierarchy and environmental degradation, including climate change, have long been inextricably intertwined and have in fact been mutual accelerants. And importantly, human mobility has always been a key feature. In many cases, in the early days of European migration or exploration, it was often unfettered and violent. The second proposition is that the law has been complicit in racialized environmental degradation historically, and further, today is inadequate in the face of cascading crises, including the changes in climate and its geopolitical impacts. So this talk will take more of a global perspective, but can easily be translated to the domestic context of the United States because we see familiar patterns, such as redlining, global redlining, but also redlining within our countries that repeat at all scales. And similarly, decision makers at all scales have generally favored low-hanging fruit in our problem solving. But if we look at the roots, we find the origins of both a dangerously cabined view of the environment and a political economy that has relied on sacrificing land and people, certain lands, certain people. And that, I would argue, is what gets us to the predicament we're in today. So here's how I will walk us through this. Looking through the lens again of climate migration, more commonly referred to as the climate refugee crisis, which I should footnote to say as a lawyer is not quite accurate, but I can share why a little bit later. But first, I'm going to discuss climate justice and climate migration as illustrated by maps, images, and graphics, which I think altogether tell a very vivid story of the root issues. I'll then consider if our legal systems, beyond just environmental law, are capable of responding adequately, especially when they might be deeply implicated in perpetuating these crises. And this discussion, of course, nods to the sort of elusive nature of justice, given the relevant systems and tools that we have at our disposal. I'll then dive more deeply into my argument about why it's so crucial to get at the roots of the problem, which reparations efforts can facilitate, and explore why closely looking in the rear view helps us better build the pathways to preferred futures moving forward. So first, mapping climate change and climate justice and its implications with climate migration. There are often statements by physical scientists that tell a geophysical story quite vividly and often lay bare the geopolitical dilemmas. This is a statement by Sir David King from over 15 years ago now. And he was saying the maps of the world will have to be redrawn. And this was in reference to glacier melt in Greenland. But this has larger meaning as we've organized ourselves in the geopolitical landscape. Because of the changes to this landscape, more may be forced to move because of climate change under suboptimal conditions. Now, of course, it's maybe worth pausing and saying climate acts on this map, but this is the map that we've created and has significant impact on how we experience that change. Borders and jurisdictions are evident here in pretty stark ways. And those borders and jurisdictions make movement more difficult within countries and across borders, and even affect our ability to mitigate the crisis because of the notion that those borders meaningfully define or delimit national interests. Many of those borders, particularly in the global South, were imposed by external forces. And today, the strength of the nation state is buttressed by the sort of formidable right to exclude, which many international law scholars have identified as being in direct conflict with the needs of migrants, for example. And that formidable right to exclude is starkly evinced by the actions of our previous presidential administration and frankly, our historic approach to migration. But here you can see it vividly in the closing days of the prior administration. This is where the physical and political map converges. We can see the border as a mode of racialized exclusion, one that is literally dynamite blasted into the canyon landscape. Again, even after the results were decided in November 2020 in that election, this was still moving in full force. And you would be hard pressed again to sort of identify which country is which just based on the physical landscape. Mexico is on the left, by the way, but again, climate change itself is indifferent when it comes to the political map. Yet we see that political map having some bigger impacts in telling the larger story. Now, regarding the larger justice and equity considerations, another map becomes immediately relevant. And here what you're seeing is this atlas of pollution. It was based on data from 2009 emissions of carbon dioxide. It was published in The Guardian in 2011. And the map is distorting countries based on their emissions at a given time. And in this moment, it was deemed to be notable because around this time, around 2007, 2008, 2009, the US was eclipsed by China in terms of annual emissions. But the bigger story here, I think, is the relative size of the rest of the world and the sizes that we see in which certain countries dwarf entire continents. You could comfortably fit South America into the United States, same with most of sub-Saharan Africa. These images also tell the story of places like the Pacific, which don't even really register beyond those small dots on the lower right hand of your screen. This is the dynamic that shapes our negotiations and has shaped our negotiations for the last almost 30 years. And we're certainly on display in Glasgow. Another image that tells the story of some of the justice struggles vis-a-vis emissions and consequences is this one. And here you're looking at the per capita emissions for the top 10 emitters. It's obviously notable that the United States and Canada, EU, China, these are countries, and this image would change. We haven't gotten updated data since the last 10 years, 2011 numbers. But what you're seeing, obviously, is that certain countries are dwarfing the world average. But what you're also not seeing is the 150 plus countries that round out this bar graph. If you were to extend the bar graph, it probably would wrap around the backside of your room before you got to a small country called the Republic of the Marshall Islands and their per capita emissions. And of course, this is important to consider when discussing responses to impacts, specific impacts, yet comprehensive and seismic in their impact of consequences for communities of climate-induced migration, and in this case, the loss of habitable territory. These were impacts that were understood to be grave effects of climate change over 30 years ago now. It's also of particular interest to us here in Hawaii, as I've mentioned, where I am, we're already a host and transition state for Pacific Islanders who are moving to the US for myriad compelling reasons, climate change being one of them. Now we know so far what the data tells us is that there are other non-climate change related dynamics that help us understand the early sea level impacts on the Western Pacific. And what you're seeing there, that small dot in the center is where I'm sitting right now. Just to the left of your screen is the image of sort of highest sea level that is both climate interacting with other sort of multi-decadal phenomena. But at this point, we're understanding that the drowning islands narrative is one that is real. It's even if it might be somewhat perspective, but even more accurate than the drowning islands narrative is the thirsty or extremely hot island narratives that are more on point, that we're seeing evidence of now: the lack of fresh water, the extreme heat, the impacts on food security. And this may be a preview of things to come, made unambiguous by media reports like this one. So while climate forecasters deem small islanders all in that sort of far end of the bar graph as among the most vulnerable to climate change impacts, a subset of small islanders, like the Marshallese, also face the specter of permanent loss of habitable state territory, rendering them potentially migrants without a home country. And the Republic of the Marshall Islands is particularly emblematic of the root issues and particularly tragic when you consider climate migration pressures on top of its colonial history, as well as its history of being subject to dozens of island obliterating US nuclear bomb tests, including the storied Bravo test, the most powerful nuclear device detonated by the US at the Bikini Atoll. First displacing Bikini Islanders to other islands within the atoll nation. And then a few decades later, we've seen that sea level rise has further displaced the islanders in the last decade, with a number of them seeking to buy land here in Hawaii. Now, I'll pause and just say a bit about migration. This image is used frequently because it really does underscore the truth of migration, sort of generally speaking, being a multi-causal event with multiple drivers. And here you're seeing that those drivers lead most people to a decision space if they have that privilege, and then they will migrate or stay based on other factors that they will take into account. And I can somewhat attest to this process. I'm from Jamaica originally, and I was too young to weigh in, but I know my parents had a migration decision-making process that looked something like this. My dad, he was motivated by political and economic drivers. My mother, social drivers, in that her husband had decided to move to Jamaica, Queens, and that was the destination at the time. But based on what I understand about climate forecasts, I would suggest that climate change is not your mother or your father's driver any longer. And increasingly so, it's going to continue to impact us. Those influences of environmental change on drivers will continue to impact us in significant and undeniable ways. There are certain things that we know about climate migration at this point. We know it's already occurring within countries. It's certainly happening in most developed countries like the United States, though I will note that it's impacting indigenous communities first and worst. It's happening in least developed countries such as the Solomon Islands in the Pacific, which saw an entire municipality needing to be proactively moved because of the impacts of sea level rise. But we know an individual or community's ability to adapt to those changes may be a greater determinant of climate-induced migration, a kind of adaptation that's been hampered actually by the historical experience of many in the global South. We know that the poorest of the poor are most vulnerable and most severely affected and usually cannot leave. So there's a phenomenon of trapped populations that's evidence of sort of the luxury of being able to move and the evidence of the financial resources and community networks and destination locations that are usually necessary. In fact, an individual's gender, age, education level, and skills will determine mobility, oftentimes determined, again, by those who are the countries that are allowing people in. And then we also know that indigenous peoples are severely affected as migration introduces a disruption to systems of traditional knowledge, as a significant heritage and cultural loss that's experienced when indigenous communities must leave their lands. I want to just sort of pause for a second, given today's likely audience, and just note the understood health impacts of this as well, which I've written about in the specific context of climate-induced migration. So we know that climate and health are massive areas that will be needing to be considered, but migration has some unique and notable impacts. And we know that from sort of prior experiences and prior research done in refugee populations in terms of effects on maternal and child health, increased risks of malnutrition and mental health threats. But we're also seeing a novel phenomenon like solastalgia, so that the pain that comes from the mental health impacts that come from the loss of your land and the loss of place and identity that many might be experiencing in place at this moment. They're compounded by social factors such as lack of language services, as well as xenophobic stigma related to disease and immigrant communities. And I will just say, just for a second, this image was just charting the increase in temperature by month over time. And when I shared this first with Paul and Jean and the Lancet Commission, Paul offered that this looks like the malignant rhythm, which I thought was a really excellent way to describe what we're seeing writ large. Excuse me. Now, the media started to take notice somewhat belatedly of the deep disruption that climate change is introducing to livelihoods and trajectories, including these that I snapped from the last couple of years, that's sort of identifying that a lot of the discussion about migration is missing a key component. And there was even a Above the Fold article, a Sunday New York Times Above the Fold article about Central American migration and climate change. And they quoted a farmer saying, "The weather is crazy, everything's out of control." Again, identifying climate change as a different kind of driver. But interestingly, in this article, climate is presented as a tipping point. Violence and poverty are prime drivers, although we're understanding more about how climate change is affecting those drivers themselves. But in the article, climate change is sort of identified as a tipping point. What we're seeing is that already today's tipping event can have profound consequences if you consider relative numbers against the backdrop of our existing legal arrangements, against the backdrop of the political fallout of that migration and this heightened period of irregular migration that we're seeing over the last 10 years. It's important to note, for example, that in the 2015 to 2016 period, one in which sort of refugee crises reemerged quite significantly, migrant flows constituted 0.2% of each of the populations of the EU and Australia, and only 0.02% of the population of the US, yet it reshaped the political discourse in all of these geographies. More recently, consider Bill McKibben's piece, in The New Yorker, from March of this year. He notes that the record hurricane season last year, with the last two storms, Eta and Iota, struck the Central America and the Northern Triangle countries, Honduras, Guatemala, El Salvador, the countries that themselves have been afflicted by climate-induced drought for a decade, leaving 3.5 million people facing food insecurity. But on top of that, the floods from those two storms produced even more severe impacts. 1,200 schools were damaged or destroyed, 40% of corn crops and 65% of the bean harvest were lost just in those two storms, and again, sitting on top of years of drought. Excuse me. It's quite early here in Hawaii, so I have sort of a tub of coffee I think we'll need to return to occasionally. But so now I want to share a bit about how, at least from the perspective of the law, we're able to grapple with this, if at all, and if at all well. From notions of agency and self-determination to fixed concepts of the nation state, the changes that are forecast and the acceleration and the rate of that change beg for earnest consideration of whether or not existing infrastructure, legal or otherwise, is up for the task. So given the impacts and their racialized nature, my research has been asking how the legal system is currently keeping up. And I can pause to say, I suspect this might be a critical question for medicine as well, right, in the climate era. How is this system going to keep up? How is it keeping up currently? And I had an interesting conversation with a friend and colleague who is a systems thinker, and she works with big companies and governments to understand whether or not their systems are resilient. In the face of challenges, they are vibrant. And the characteristics that she sort of distilled were those of, the ability for that system to see itself as complex, to make meaning and sense of challenges, to align around the next best action, the ability to test, prototype, learn, and adapt. And without diving into this too much, because this is a whole other hour-long lecture that I could give, I'll say that the legal system, with respect to climate change and certainly climate justice, struggles on all fronts. And in some respects, it should, right? Consistency and predictability are key to procedural justice, right? So that, adaptability and the, sort of prototyping is not so much our forte. And in some ways that's a good thing in terms of some of the elements of justice that we'd like to see achieved. But you can argue that we are justified in seeking more from our legal systems because it's plausible, if not probable, that the global experience a more than 3 degrees Celsius temperature increase, and possibly 5 degrees Celsius by 2080. And that global temperature increase would quite literally produce a whole new world. And for context, an increase of just 1.1 C above normal, our current status, produces fire tornadoes, right? Fires that create their own weather, massive and repetitive hurricanes hitting the Caribbean and Gulf Coast, as well as 100-degree heat waves and wildfires in Siberia, which have in the last couple of summers rendered their June and parts of July hotter than Honolulu. So the severity and the speed and the recent governance failures at multiple scales suggest that our infrastructure is underprepared. Now, to say that we need to figure this out may sound obvious, but I have to emphasize the we, right? Those of us who are concerned with justice, equity, and rights and the problem solving. And right now, the mobility options for those on the move are circumscribed by increasingly antiquated 20th century parameters. They include a move to the rare neighboring country that allows unrestricted entry, formal international migration programs that facilitate entry to high-income countries, but only for a select few, such as skilled worker visa programs. And then there's the extra legal, clandestine, and often life-threatening journey to another country to seek asylum. And despite the popular use of the term climate refugees, the Refugee Convention cannot, and some argue should not, provide protections for the vast majority of those fleeing climate impacts for multiple reasons. So existing law and policy, as well as the lack of relevant laws, can aggravate the negative impact of climate change itself. And worse still, in the absence of better or balanced information on or planning for climate's influence on human mobility to sort of fill a relative void, there are vivid narratives fueling demagogues throughout the global north and south, and effectively creating a self-fulfilling prophecy regarding the climate crisis and conflict at all scales, perhaps rendering that climate conflict nexus inevitable. And regarding demagogues and accompanying dangers, I share this resource for you. If anyone thinks you're getting too much sleep at night, try this book for keeping you up. It's quite vivid, not enough time to dive deeply into it, but suffice it to say, there's vibrant conversation, planning, and investment occurring outside of the formal and considered legal system, which includes lucrative smart borders, weaponized drones, again, all to defend against those who are already ritually dehumanized or erased in the story around climate change and its impacts. So solving for this is urgent. And because the source of the problem is also deeply rooted, it requires a broad and a scope and deep ambition. And climate justice as a field of law and legal theory that's emerging and becoming significantly more important has a lot to say about this. Professor Anna Greer, for example, analyzes law's structural complicity and the uneven outcomes and forecasts for the poor and of color globally. She notes that the very design of the law, particularly corporate law and international trade, is fundamentally predisposed to environmental degradation and indifferent at best to the heightened vulnerability of much of the global South to externally driven change. So efforts to do less harm, limit the excesses of our global political economy, and understand that climate change is not an issue that's discrete to be resolved over there, but a context or landscape to be navigated will be key. But Marcus Hickel also has a lot to say about this. He argues, among other things, that the inability to clearly articulate duties or obligations in response to identifiable rights is a wrong in itself. And there are other international environmental law scholars that have prescribed the same, exploring what those duties or obligations might look like and exhorting us to be granular when answering the question, what are the duties that we have to those who are at the front lines? Climate justice can also leverage other relevant critiques, such as Jaya Ramji-Nagalis's critique of migration law, and what she argues is the active creation of refugee crises by the law's own parameters. It does this by, for example, requiring that migrants access a state's territory to appeal for refugee status, again, embarking more likely than not on a risky and extra-legal journey. And she demonstrates that the crisis is itself created by existing legal systems and its infrastructure choices. It's not a crisis of absolute capacity, given the relative size of cross-border migrant flows, as I mentioned earlier. Now, the fact that sites of greatest disruption and dislocation are in the global South and the sites of greatest contention and rights violations are at our borders is part of that larger story of racialized differences in both mobility and wealth. Specific contemporary harms are beginning to get their due attention, particularly salient and jarring after the racial reckoning of last summer, which did reverberate around the globe. Related to vastly different experiences of environmental degradation, we can consider the research, which we're seeing some important indications of. Diffenbaugh and Burke have done recent studies noting that demonstrating that climate change is causing countries like Nigeria to become poorer, while countries like Norway are seeing net economic benefit so far. At the same time, Nigerians contend with specific devastating impacts like heat extremes, depicted vividly here. In Nigeria, this New York Times article describes rising temperatures are supercharged by nonstop gas flares. You can feel them singe the skin. We see familiar patterns repeat at all scales and is mirrored in cities across the United States. One example is redlining and its legacy. The researchers here, Hoffman et al., conducted a spatial analysis of 108 urban areas in the US to better understand how historically redlined neighborhoods, which remain predominantly lower income and of color, related to current patterns of the urban heat island effect. And their research revealed that 94% of the areas studied experienced elevated temperatures in formerly redlined areas, with temperature differences averaging 5 degrees Fahrenheit warmer and as great as 12.6 degrees Fahrenheit above non-redlined neighborhoods. And these spikes already are sitting atop the urban heat island effect in those cities. So while extreme heat days are projected to increase dramatically, the legacy of segregation exacerbates climate change for those redlined communities. And it is the same for flood risk. Homes in formerly redlined neighborhoods are more likely to be flooded than non-redlined homes. And this is according to research from a real estate brokerage firm. The report examined floodplain data from 38 major US metropolitan areas and noted that modern US flood risk maps look a lot like redlining maps from the 1930s. And Redfin, the real estate brokerage firm, their chief economist said the discrimination that happened in the past may seem like it happened a long time ago, but it compounds. It's not like the historical practices that were discriminatory diminish in effect. It seems like they actually increase in effect. And the research goes on to cite examples of flooding in Chicago and New Orleans after Katrina, neighborhoods in Houston after Harvey. And we see that there is displacement that's affiliated and associated with that, in addition to the acute in situ impacts. But if you consider the global migration crisis here at home, Queen Cat has an important story to share as well. Coastal crises, cultural heritage, and loss of homeland also collide in the Carolinas in such a way that violent storms themselves, the repeated incidents of them, as well as heartache, has killed many people that have been displaced. But we can see this seemingly unique 21st century story is even older, and this really goes back to the beginning. Racial hierarchy and environmental disruption have been mutual accelerants. And according to recent research, that has been true, that relationship has been true since as early as the 15th century. In this study from Koch et al., researchers concluded that the great dying of the indigenous peoples of the Americas resulted in human-driven global impact on the Earth system in the 2 centuries prior to the Industrial Revolution. The great dying resulted in large part from disease, but also warfare, enslavement of indigenous peoples, and hunger following social disintegration. That we're talking about the loss of tens of millions of lives. There was reforestation in the places where they once lived that was so significant, it sequestered carbon and resulted in dips in temperature that are notable, and also show that human actions had global impacts on the Earth system as early as the 15th century. Similarly, researchers Lewis and Maslin argue that this event is the strongest of just two to mark the start of the Anthropocene, the proposed geological period in which humans have left an indelible imprint in the Earth's stratigraphy. They call it the Great Divergence, and they describe it as sort of the agricultural commodities from the vast new lands of the Americas, allowing Europe to transcend its ecological limits and sustain economic growth. This was initiated and sustained, ironically, by unfettered migration and human mobility out of Europe and throughout the rest of the globe. So the impacts of enslavement, colonialism, and their aftermath allowed a small cohort to grow through accessing much greater resources, human and natural bodies. And understanding this history will affect our construction of just solutions moving forward. And this, I believe, is the promise of the reparative effort. So I'll just briefly talk about what we were doing in the climate section of the Lancet Commission's work on reparations and redistributive justice. And this invitation allowed me to revisit a 2009 project on climate reparations, and again, provided that incredible opportunity to work with Paul, Jean, and Jason, but also my brilliant co-author, geographer, Sonia Klinsky. We have been separately working on the issues, and together I came up with what I think are helpful ways to understand a relatively hefty issue. But we were making the case, both moral and strategic, for climate reparations. And the moral case for climate reparations becomes abundantly clear when you account the numerous disproportionate burdens that I sort of touched on earlier. There's much more, and there's not enough time to detail all of it. But in short, the suffering has been uneven. The indirect violence and trauma of overconsumption and unjust enrichment have been borne by many for the benefit of a privileged few. The outcomes and prognoses are grave. And the resolution to ensure that all of us survive and ideally thrive requires the infusion of diverse resources to reduce emissions dramatically and support adaptive capacity and rebounding and rehabilitating from losses. There's also strategic benefit. We must properly diagnose the problem to repair the climate crisis and not repeat the initiating and now decades and centuries old harm. The carbon economy has required sacrifice zones, and sacrifice zones, whether here in the US or globally, have required a violent racial hierarchy. Eliminating that dynamic and remediating it will yield benefits that inure to everyone. Eliminating the underlying logic also limits the likelihood of it happening again in the context of our clean energy, renewable energy future. Blending the moral and strategic, reparations are meant to right wrongs and forge right relationships between parties. And I'll say, as controversial as the term can be, it's a common feature in international law. As a practical matter, the relationships within our country, between the global North and South, and across movements need to be repaired to build trust and solidarity in the face of mounting change. So I invite those who I talk to about this to, instead of asking if reparations are appropriate or feasible, to consider what the operative question really is, which is it remotely remotely adequate climate action even possible without collective action? And if not, can collective action of this scale emerge with current relationships? And if not, what would facilitate this repair? And in so many ways, we can see that reckoning with the past and a consideration of grappling with the roots will help us to get to that point of facilitation and coming up with reparative schemes that are comprehensive and will make whole to whatever degree is possible, given that the changing times. But a couple of small and very specific responses to migration, for example, might be found in literature and research by 12 scholars, Third World approaches to international law scholars like Tendayo Chume, who makes very persuasive arguments regarding migration and decolonization. And it becomes sort of a especially relevant instruction manual if we're appropriately taking the long view with respect to mobility and climate. She argues that against the backdrop of colonialism and the centuries of free and consequential movement of Europeans throughout the global South, there's an obligation of formal colonial powers to open their borders to former colonial subjects. Similarly, Professor Carmen Gonzalez argues for migration as reparations and bails out earlier proposals from other established legal scholars like Mike Gerard, who in an editorial in 2015 suggested that countries take responsibility for addressing climate-induced migration proportional to their historical contribution to the crisis. As I see it, however, to be more successful broadly, climate reparations must also prioritize that most important prong, which is non-repetition. And we should also ask the question, whether it's in the specific context of migration or more broadly, what does my non-repetition look like in this context? And for climate change, this is an extraordinary question because more than repairing or compensating for past harms, it asks for us to really understand the foundational faults in contemporary life. I've argued in a few pieces that in addition to apology and a demonstration of a commitment to repair, those reparations claims should also include and emphasize that guarantee of non-repetition, which is the most transformative element of repair and its capacity to effectuate meaningful change. And I think what we'll see is that these calls will become more nuanced and more public as time passes. Solutions using reparative models and at scale have firmly emerged as major rallying points alongside more system-provoking calls to action. And there's evidence that these calls to action will not slow down, but in fact that the post-Glasgow period will see an acceleration of those calls. So climate migration itself is just one manifestation of climate change's profound impacts. It does present novel legal issues that will upend some of our sort of longstanding understandings of how the world works. This unique kind of 21st century statelessness that the Marshallese must contemplate is a significant example of that. It also echoes longstanding claims for justice and provokes all the unfinished work of our current legal regimes, namely power, whether from the sort of subsidized fossil fuel derived electrons to that uneven heft at the international negotiations table. Also historical contributions, both to the climate crisis and other communities and countries' vulnerability to it. And further, major components of our legal infrastructure have gotten us here and supported continued paralysis. And to guarantee non-repetition, the answer is not simply don't use fossil fuels again, as incredibly important as that is. The full articulation is for a sort of another longer presentation. And I suspect Jason may have a few things to say about this as well, as I've learned a lot from him about this in particular. But I'll preview by saying for the law that to say that more international environmental law is necessary is not quite the answer. Those most severely impacted need us to do less harm, to actually pore over existing laws and related governance regimes of international trade, for example, the Code of Multinationals, and expunge those that further accelerate climate and racial crises, to ensure that environmental agencies have as much ability to determine public policy as the treasuries, indeed to break down the actual and conceptual isolation of ecological limits and environmental laws from the crafting of, say, commercial laws, which are the most impactful on the places we live, work, and play. And because I'm nearing the end of a climate presentation, I do feel like, I feel compelled to end on a happy note and a hopeful note. And most of the time that is pictures of windmills or vast fields of solar arrays, but that's not how I'll end this one, though I do think it's an important part of the full the sort of panoply of responses. But instead, I want to highlight that the intellectual technology also already exists, that there are alternative paradigms or and paradigms for non-repetitive legal structures that will be important for us to really take seriously. Numerous rights discourses and critical legal theories have highlighted these inequities, the mutual acceleration, and have over time forwarded elegant and longstanding alternatives. The principles that are most just for the worst off, including the non-human natural world, are embraced and articulated by the literatures on traditional knowledge and indigenous legal orders, on earth jurisprudence, environmental justice, as well as third world approaches to international law. And while those discourses may appear a radical departure from current socio-legal structures, they're no more radical than the future we're consigning ourselves to. And at the same time, they may be mandated by those who truly seek justice in a climate-constrained world. Now, full realization of those new structures will not come in time. I think we'll be building the solar plane as we fly it, if you will. But there is some good news in the meantime. I do think that there, at least at its beginnings, the administration had a very clear-eyed understanding of the urgency of the crisis and outlined specific priorities and intentions. And that was evident in naming climate-induced migration, understanding that this was a climate disruption that was not getting any attention, and the fact that it named it was a significant advance. And then, of course, in order to build programs and to understand the best plan moving forward, the administration issued this executive order that looked at a whole of government approach to climate-induced migration, but also a whole of government approach that we see across departments that are looking to understand how climate change can be most significantly integrated into all elements of our foreign policy. And this perceptual shift is important, if a bit underwhelming, given the scale and speed of the crisis, real talk here, but by the byproduct of that shift signals at a minimum that there's a possible evolution in the legal order. Depending on the speed in which it develops, it could well be revolutionary and certainly like nothing we've seen before. So I will close there and look forward to discussion during the Q&A session. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Maxine, for that brilliant presentation. I think our faculty will agree that, to me, that was a Department of Global Health and Social Medicine presentation par excellence. You really took us beyond sort of pat explanations of climate change in carbon production terms and really helped us understand how it's co-produced by racism and legacies of colonialism. So we'll save all the Q&A and discussion for the end, but right now I'd like to introduce Dr. Jason Hickel to present in synergy with his colleague Maxine. Jason is if you haven't had a chance to read his work, I highly recommend it. 2 books in particular, The Divide and then Less is More, How Degrowth Will Save the World, are really, as Paul mentioned, kind of consciousness changing works that are accessible on a public intellectual level. And so I think he's leading the way on helping transform consciousness. And so I look forward to hearing his remarks on climate justice and degrowth. Jason.
Thanks very much, Gene. Just give me 1 second here to share my screen. Okay. Okay. Yeah, so first of all, thank you, Maxine, for that brilliant presentation. And thanks to both Eugene and Paul for organizing this session. It's a real honor for me to be here with you all and to support what you're doing. So what I want to do today is argue that addressing the crisis of climate breakdown, and moreover, doing it in a way that is socially just and attentive to the colonial dimensions of this crisis, requires degrowth in the rich countries of the global north. So I'm going to make that argument while also explaining a little bit about what degrowth is, although very, very briefly, and how it can be accomplished in a manner that supports and improves social outcomes. So this is just going to be very introductory. You'll have to forgive me. So first, I want to start by setting out sort of where we're at with respect to the most prominent dimension of the ecological crisis, which is climate breakdown. And of course, I'm going to argue that this is not the only dimension to pay attention to. So we're presently at 1.1 degrees of global warming. And even at this level, the effects are clearly disastrous. Our media tend to focus mostly on damages that occur in the global north, but in fact, as Maxine has pointed out, the vast majority of the impact is being inflicted on the global south. So I want to highlight that just a little bit here to sort of complement what Maxine is arguing. So we already know that the world is experiencing a rising incidence of extreme storms. In Mozambique, for instance, the country's second largest city was literally flattened by a massive cyclone in 2019. Puerto Rico was destroyed by Hurricane Maria in 2017 and is still in the process of recovery. We're seeing more serious heat waves. Heat waves in India and Pakistan, for example, kill hundreds of people a year. And in 2015, a single heat event killed several thousand. We're seeing more extreme droughts in Northeast Africa and Central America have in some regions basically totally possibility of agriculture, forcing people to migrate to more habitable countries. And then, of course, there are the wildfires. We all know of the infernos that have blazed across California and Australia, but the fires that have scorched the rainforests of Brazil and Indonesia are equally devastating in scale and consequence. All told, according to the most recent data we have, some 30 million people are being displaced by climate breakdown every year. This, of course, is triggering major social and political upheaval. For these people, climate apocalypse is not some abstract future possibility. It's already here. Now, we know that in order to stay under 1.5 degrees, as the Paris Agreement stipulates, global emissions have to be cut in half by 2030. And that's the green line in this graph, which is declining dramatically from historical trends, okay? That's what's required of us. But so far, government pledges are nowhere near achieving this target. Most people are not aware of this fact, but even if all countries uphold their pledges, global emissions will not decline at all over the coming decade. And that reality, that unfortunate reality, is represented in the blue line here in this graph. And by the way, this accounts for the new pledges that were made in Glasgow, right? So they didn't get us very far. Moreover, right now, existing government policies have us on track for at least 2.7 degrees of heating, right? Which is way over the target. This is literally the future that we're presently planning to head toward with all policies intact. And this, of course, represents a total failure of our governments and a very dangerous future indeed. So we might ask, what will the world look like as we start to approach 3 degrees? I'm going to give a very brief overview of some of the existing science on this, just to kind of, again, set the stage. Sea levels are projected to rise by 1 to 2 meters, which will swamp many coastal regions and coastal cities and significantly exacerbate coastal storm damage. Some 30 to 50% of the species on our planet will be wiped out at 3 degrees. And I don't know about you, but every time I encounter this figure, I find it almost too horrifying to contemplate. I mean, this is like a dismantling of the web of life. More than 1.5 billion human beings will be displaced from their homes by climate impacts at 3 degrees, triggering, of course, mass migration on a scale that dwarfs anything that we've yet witnessed. And the yields of staple crops will decline significantly to the point where the United Nations itself is now warning of multi-breadbasket failure and sustained food supply disruptions globally in such a scenario, with famines potentially affecting several regions at once. Okay. So this is why Kevin Anderson, who's one of the UK's leading climate scientists, is very clear that 3 degrees is not compatible with organized human civilization as we know it. That's the reality we face, and this is the future that we're effectively headed toward. Now, we have a tendency to refer to this crisis using the language of the Anthropocene. And this terminology, of course, is useful to highlight the fact that for the first time in geological history, human activity is dramatically reshaping our planet and our climate. But it's also incorrect. It's not humans as such that are causing this crisis. Rather, it's being driven by our economic system, which is capitalism, and is caused almost entirely by a small number of rich countries in the global north, primarily to the benefits of elites and corporations. Okay. Now, this is perhaps clearest when it comes to the question of emissions. The countries of the global north are responsible for the vast majority of the excess emissions that are causing climate breakdown. And we can measure this actually by taking the safe planetary boundary, which is 350 parts per million concentration of CO2 in the atmosphere, dividing it in an equitable way across the global population, right, across history, and then determining which countries are responsible for overshooting their fair share of the planetary boundary, okay? So we did this analysis in a recent article for The Lancet, the results of which are displayed in this graph. And we see that the USA alone is responsible for 40% of excess emissions. In other words, they're responsible for 40% of all damages caused by climate breakdown all around the world. The global north as a group which includes the USA, Canada, Europe, and Australia, New Zealand, and Japan, is responsible for 92%. And that's the area represented in this graph by the dark green, which of course gobbles up most of the space. Okay. Meanwhile, the entire continents of Africa, Asia, and Latin America, home to the vast majority of the world's population, are responsible for only 8% of excess emissions. And that's the light green in this graph. Furthermore, most of the countries in the global south, including big nations like India, Indonesia, Nigeria, are still well within their fair share of the planetary boundary and have therefore not contributed to the problem at all. So in light of this, I argue that we should understand this reality as a process of atmospheric colonization. The atmosphere is a shared commons on which all of us depend for our existence, and rich countries have appropriated it for their own enrichments, with devastating consequences for the global south and for all of life on Earth. Meanwhile, the global south, which has done very little to cause this problem, suffers 82 to 92% of all of the economic costs and damages inflicted by climate breakdown, and suffers 98 to 99% of all climate-related deaths. In other words, virtually all climate-related mortality is sustained in the territories of the global south. It would be difficult to overstate the scale of this injustice when you compare cause and effect here. And we can see this inverse relationship very clearly if we look at a map showing which countries are most responsible for excess emissions, and then compare this to a map showing which countries are most vulnerable to climate impacts. So let's see what this looks like. So the red nations in this map are those that have contributed most to causing climate breakdown, as per the Lancet study I just showed you. And as you can see, of course, it is overwhelmingly the countries of the global north, okay, as I've defined it. Now, in this second map, the red nations are the ones that are most vulnerable to the impacts of climate breakdown. And as you can see, it's overwhelmingly the countries in the global south that are most affected. Indeed, the two maps are almost exact inversions of one another. In other words, not only is climate breakdown being driven by processes of atmospheric colonization, it is also that the consequences are playing out along colonial lines. So if we're not attentive to the obvious colonial dimensions of the climate crisis, then we're clearly missing the point. I also want to show you this map, just very briefly. This comes from a recent paper in the journal Nature Climate Change, and it shows the geographical distribution of deadly climate conditions at 2 to 3 degrees of global warming, right? Which again is the future that we're presently headed toward with all existing policies. The yellow regions will experience around 100 days of deadly heat per year, okay? And the red regions will experience around 300 days of deadly heat per year. As you can see, much of the global south will be plunged into conditions so extreme as to render whole parts of the tropics basically uninhabitable for humans. For these regions, 2.7 degrees is literally a death sentence. And again, that is the future we are headed toward, unless we can bring about a very dramatic change in direction. Okay. So in light of these realities, it's clear that rich nations' targets to decarbonize by 2050 are woefully inadequate. Let me explain why. Crucially, achieving zero emissions by 2050, right, which is required to stay under 1.5 degrees, is a global average target, a global average necessity. Given their disproportionate contributions to excess emissions, rich countries have a responsibility, even under the Paris agreements, to decarbonize much faster than this in order to give poorer nations more time to transition. Every additional ton of CO2 that rich nations emit represents more atmospheric colonization, because remember, they've already exceeded their fair share of the planetary boundaries. So every additional ton is additional colonization. So pledges for zero by 2050 are in effect pledges to continue colonizing the atmospheric commons for another 30 years, okay? It's a slap in the face of the global south, a violation of basic climate justice principles, and it is unacceptable. We should be calling on our leaders to take much more dramatic action. And of course, the USA must lead this. Now, crucially, climate change is not the only crisis we face. And this reality, unfortunately, tends to fall out of our media discourse, but it's very important. So the global economy is presently overshooting several other planetary boundaries, not just climate change, including land system change, by which we mean basically deforestation and habitat destruction, biogeochemical flows, which is mostly from chemically intensive industrial agriculture, mostly for industrial meat production, which depletes the soil and poisons water ecosystems, and species extinction, right? Right now, the rate of species extinction is 1,000 times faster than prior to the Industrial Revolution, right? Now, crucially, these impacts, where plant shoots are being driven by excess resource use. In other words, all of the material stuff that we extract and produce every year. Show you this graph, which illustrates global research for the past half century. Now, this metric adds up weights of metals. Cement graph is what scientists say is the maximum sustainable boundary, which is about 50 billion tons per year. So as you can see, we shot past that threshold in the late 1990s. And at the time, economists promised that more efficient technology and a shift to services would bring resource use down. But in fact, the opposite has happened. Resource use has accelerated. And as of 2020, we're now consuming 100 billion tons per year, which is overshooting the maximum boundary by a factor of 2. Now, this is a problem because resource use is the single most powerful driver of environmental damage. It accounts for 90% of variation in environmental damage indicators and accounts for 90% of biodiversity loss. Okay, so this is a crucial indicator to track. And here again, rich countries are overwhelmingly responsible for causing the problem. And this is clear when we look at this graph, which shows per capita resource use by country income group. Again, the red line is the maximum sustainable level in per capita terms. And we see that rich countries, which are on the far right of this graph, consume on average 28 tons of resources per person per year, which is 4 times over the maximum boundary. And by the way, vastly in excess of what is required to meet human needs, even at a high standard. Now, crucially, not all residents of rich countries are equally responsible for this, and this is true of emissions as well. Richer individuals consume much more than working class people, and more importantly, these high levels of resource use are an effect of an economic system that is organized around commodification and profits and growth, rather than around meeting human needs. But meanwhile, lower income countries consume a small fraction of what high income countries do, and they remain, in fact, well within sustainable levels. In most cases, they actually need to increase resource use in order to build the infrastructure required for human development. Okay, hospitals, roads, universities, and so on. So here's the key facts. Oh, sorry, by the way, I just wanted to mention here a crucial fact, which is that if all countries were to consume like rich countries do, right, we would need the equivalent of about 4 planets to sustain us. On the other hand, if rich countries consumed closer to the global average, we would not at present be in a condition of global ecological breakdown at all, which is extraordinary. I want you to let that fact sink in. Now here too, when it comes to resource use, just as with emissions, this represents a process of colonization. Now let me explain briefly what I mean by that. Here's the key facts. Growth in the global north relies on a massive net appropriation of resources from the global south, right? More than half of that excess resource use that I illustrated earlier in the global north is net appropriated from the global south. And this should be clear, I guess, to anyone who pays attention to where our products are actually produced, right? So all of the cotton in our clothes, the rare minerals in our technologies, our bananas, our coffee, our tea, all of this is produced in the south with southern resources. And what this means is that the social and ecological impacts of northern growth and resource consumption are offshored or externalized to the global south. That's where the damage happens. It happens at the resource frontiers. Southern ecosystems are effectively being plundered to support continued growth in the global north, okay? Now, I'm a scientist, and so it's important for me to be empirical about this. This is not just a rant. As it happens, we're actually able to calculate the full scale of net appropriation from the global south in empirical terms. And the figures are quite staggering. Let me give you a sense for what this looks like, okay? We're talking about a net total of 12 billion tons of embodied raw materials is appropriated from the global south each year. And by embodied here, I mean materials that are involved in the production of goods that are ultimately consumed in the global north, okay? Net of trade. So to put this in perspective, 12 billion tons is double the total mass of resources that's extracted from the continent of Africa every year. And this quantity is transferred to the north for free without any equivalent compensation in return. Okay. 21 exajoules of embodied energy is also net appropriated from the South each year. And to put this in perspective, that amount of energy would be enough to bring the entire population of the global South up to a level of energy use sufficient to meet human needs at a high standard. But instead, it is used to fuel growth in the global North. Okay. 800 million hectares of embodied land is net appropriated from the global South each year. To put this one in perspective, that's twice the size of India. And that amount of land could be used to provide nutritious food for 4 to 6 billion people, but instead it is used to produce things like sugar for Coca-Cola and beef for McDonald's consumed in the global North. And 200 million person years of embodied labor is net appropriated from the South each year. So that's the size of Latin America's entire workforce, working all year round, right? That labor could be used to staff hospitals and schools and produce food and goods for local needs. But instead, these workers work full-time year after year, churning out tech gadgets and fast fashion for Northern corporations. In sum, growth in the global North is literally sucking the life out of ecosystems and human communities in the global South. So the point I want to underline here is that this pattern of imperial appropriation not only offshores ecological damage to the global South, it also deprives the South of the use values that are necessary to meet human needs, the concrete resources and human capacities that are necessary for human development. In other words, the dual crisis of ecological breakdown and mass poverty is an effect of the imperialist world economy. Okay. Now, net appropriation by the global North is a long-standing feature of the world economy. And I just want to briefly explain this kind of in historical context, right? Now, this fact is obvious, of course, during the colonial period from 1492 onward. The rise of capitalism in Western Europe relied utterly on the appropriation of resources from the colonies and on the use of enslaved and indentured labor on a truly vast scale, right? This is well established. Now, crucially, this arrangement was interrupted briefly in the middle of the 20th century when radical and progressive movements in the global South achieved political independence and set about dismantling the mechanisms of imperial appropriation. They used tariffs, capital controls, nationalization, and so on to achieve economic sovereignty, right? To pursue economic sovereignty. But this interlude did not last long. Northern states were upset that their access to cheap labor and resources was being cut off, remember, on which their growth relied, was being cut off. And they responded first with a series of coups to depose key progressive leaders. I won't relate that history, although it's devastating. And then by using the World Bank and the IMF to impose neoliberal structural adjustment programs across most of the global South during the 1980s and 1990s. Now, structural adjustment reversed the South's progressive reforms in one fell swoop. They cut tariffs, they cut capital controls, they dismantled protections on labor and on the environment. And the main effect of this, okay, for our purposes here, was to cheapen the prices of labor and resources. Now, what this means is that for every unit of labor and resources that the South imports from the North, they have to then export many more units to pay for it. That's what happens when you have price differentials induced by structural adjustment. And this is what we refer to as unequal exchange. It generates the large net flows of resources from south to north that I've described. So this is the form that imperial appropriation or economic imperialism takes in the 21st century. It's an arrangement that enables appropriation without the need, in most cases, for direct military occupation. Okay, so in light of all this, what needs to happen? I want to argue that our response must be commensurate to these realities. And let me break this down into two key dimensions. The first thing is that rich countries need to scale down their use of the planet's resources, and I mean quite dramatically, by around 75% from existing levels, okay? Now, the existing dominant discourse accepts this fact, but claims that resource use can be reduced through green growth. And the idea here is that efficiency improvements will allow us to achieve an absolute decoupling of GDP from resource use, such that GDP will rise indefinitely even while resource use declines. Now, this sounds wonderful, but the only problem is that scientists reject this narrative as empirically baseless. And this is a thoroughgoing rejection. GDP growth remains tightly coupled to resource use, despite dramatic improvements in efficiency and technology over the past few decades. There is no evidence of absolute decoupling, and all existing models that we have project that it is unlikely to be achieved in the future, even under highly optimistic assumptions about efficiency and technological change. And these results have been confirmed by scientists several times over the past few years. Now, the main reason for this, very briefly, is that in growth-focused economies, gains from efficiency improvements are mobilized to expand the process of production and consumption, which makes absolute reductions very difficult to achieve. Okay, so in other words, it's not technology, it's not our technology that is lacking. It's not our technology that's the problem here. The problem is growth. So what this means is that if rich countries are to achieve sufficient reductions in resource use, they need to abandon growthism as an objective. Okay. Okay, now what about climates? Now remember, again, in order to stay under 1.5 degrees, we need to cut emissions to 0 by 2050. And high income nations, given their disproportionate share of historical responsibility, must decarbonize faster than this, right? But there's a problem. It is not possible for us to achieve such rapid rates of decarbonization if high income nations continue to pursue growth at the same time. And the reason is because growth is coupled to energy demands. So more growth means more energy demands than would otherwise be the case. This is a problem because more energy demands makes it more difficult and probably impossible to cover it with renewable alternatives in the short time we have left before we blow the 1.5 degrees budget. Okay. Politicians know this fact, but they cannot bring themselves to face it. In order to reconcile their desire for continued growth with their commitments under the Paris agreements, they bet heavily on speculative negative emissions schemes to save us. The idea is that even if we overshoot the Paris emissions targets, that's okay, because we can pull excess carbon back out of the atmosphere later in the century. And by the way, the US administration under Biden and Kerry is equally complicit in this assumption. The problem here is that scientists increasingly highly dangerous. If it fails, we will be locked into a hothouse trajectory that would be impossible for us to escape. It's a massive gamble with the future of all of life on Earth, all in order to defend economic growth in the global North. So if we scale down our assumptions about negative emissions, the evidence is clear that to stay under 1.5 degrees, high income nations will need to abandon growth as an objective. And if you're interested in learning more about the science that's involved here, we review the relevant evidence in a recent article in Nature Energy, and I write about it at length in my latest book, Less is More. So in light of this evidence, ecological economists call for a fundamentally different approach. The first step is to realize that high-income nations do not need more growth. After a certain level, which high-income nations have long surpassed, the relationship between commodity production and human welfare totally breaks down. What actually matters when it comes to human well-being is what we're producing, whether people have access to those things, and how income is distributed, right? That's what counts. In fact, we know that it's possible to meet human needs at a high standard with much less energy and resources than rich countries presently use, and with much less commodity production. The key is to scale down less necessary forms of production while organizing the economy around human well-being rather than around capital accumulation, okay? So this is what's known as degrowth. Degrowth calls for a planned reduction of excess resource and energy use in high-income nations to bring the economy back into balance with the living world in a just and equitable way, okay? So what does this look like in practice? It's quite straightforward, actually. Instead of assuming that every sector of the economy must grow all the time, regardless of whether or not we actually need it, we should decide what sectors of the economy we actually need to improve. So things like renewable energy, public transportation, healthcare access, and so on. And what sectors are clearly destructive and should be actively scaled down. So things like SUVs, private jets, air travel, fast fashion, industrial beef, advertising, finance, the practice of planned obsolescence, the military industrial complex, and so on, right? There are huge chunks of the economy that are organized mostly around corporate power and elite consumption, and we would be better off without them. This approach is powerful in terms of climate mitigation because it would significantly reduce energy use. And this is important Because again, the less energy we use, the easier it is to achieve a rapid transition to renewables, fast enough to stay under 1.5 degrees. And we have demonstrated this empirically in published models. And this approach also, needless to say, would succeed in bringing resource use down significantly. So it's not just focused on climate, it also brings resource use down. And this is the coherent value of it. Now, most people would regard this as obviously sensible, except for one sticking point. What about jobs and livelihoods, right? As we scale down unnecessary economic activity, won't that lead to unemployment? And clearly, such a scenario would be politically untenable. Nobody would agree to that future. Fortunately, there's a simple solution. As the economy requires less labor, we can shorten the working week and share necessary work more evenly, okay? So the good news is that we know that shorter working hours deliver big improvements in human well-being, in health and in gender equality, while at the same time dramatically reducing emissions. And it also happens to be resoundingly popular every time it's polled, okay? We can also roll out a climate job guarantee. Such a program would ensure that anyone can train to participate in the most important collective projects of our generation, building renewable energy capacity, insulating homes, producing local food, and regenerating ecosystems. This would allow us to permanently end unemployment, okay? And ensure access to dignified, socially necessary work for all. At the same time, we need to expand universal public services to ensure that all people have access to the resources they need to live good lives without requiring ever-rising incomes in order to do so. And here I mean not just healthcare and education, but also housing, public transit, clean energy, water, and internet. All of the basics, right, should be brought out of the realm of commodification and decommodified for the sake of human well-being and survival. On top of this, we need to dramatically reduce inequality and distribute income more fairly. Now, this is key. People often ask me whether there will be enough income in a degrowth scenario to meet human needs. And the answer to this is yes, by definition, there will be. Income is simply the obverse of the total prices of all of the stuff that is consumed in the economy, okay? There's always exactly enough income to buy everything that the economy produces. So long as we are producing what people actually need, then there will always be, by definition, enough income to buy it, so long as the income is distributed fairly. Distribution is everything here. So we can do this with a living wage or living income policy to sort of raise the floor at the bottom, while at the same time taxing the rich to the point where they are, quite simply, no longer rich. Thomas Piketty has pointed out this is one of the single most powerful climate policies we can deploy. And I realize it may sound radical, but in an era of ecological breakdown, we have to acknowledge the fact that it is irrational and dangerous to continue to devote resources and energy to supporting an over-consuming class. So taking this approach, okay, establishing a firm social guarantee and sharing resources more fairly would allow us to ensure decent livelihoods for all, delinking human well-being from economic growth so that we can pursue radical climate action without anyone getting hurt. This is the bread and butter of a just transition. Okay. Now, I want to emphasize, as I wrap up here, that the demand for degrowth is not just about ecology. Rather, it is rooted in anti-colonial principles. Degrowth scholarship calls for an end to the colonial patterns of appropriation that underpin Northern growth in order to release the South from the grip of extractivism and from a future of catastrophic climate breakdown. Southern countries should be free to organize their resources and labor around meeting human needs rather than around servicing Northern growth. Degrowth is, in other words, a demand for decolonization. And it's important to recognize that degrowth scholarship builds on the legacy of anti-colonial thinkers like Frantz Fanon, Gandhi, Julius Nyerere, Thomas Sankara, and Berta Cáceres, people who knew that capitalism in the global north was driving colonization in the global south. And this thinking is reflected very clearly today in the People's Agreement of Cochabamba, okay, which was signed in 2010 by thousands of social movements from across the global south, calling for the governments of rich countries to cease their appropriation of the planet's commons, scale down their resource use, and decolonize the atmosphere. This is the language they use. The Cochabamba Statement is, to my mind, the single most powerful climate document that has ever been written. And it's much more radical and coherent than anything in mainstream Western discourse. If you've not read it yet, by the way, I urge you to do so. Social movements in the global South recognize that ecological breakdown is being driven ultimately by capitalism. They recognize that it has clear imperial dimensions, and they call for an anti-colonial struggle in response. It is incumbent on all of us to stand in solidarity with this demand. And by the way, the Cochabamba statement embodies degrowth principles avant la lettre. So as the 21st century unfolds, we must strive for a world where everyone can live healthy, dignified lives in balance with the planet's ecosystems. And this requires a radical convergence in the global economy, okay? Resource use in the global north needs to decline dramatically to get back to sustainable levels, while resource use in the south must be reclaimed for meeting human needs, converging at a level that is consistent with universal human welfare and ecological stability, okay, which we defined empirically and represented in models, okay? So we know the steps we need to take to stop climate breakdown. But we must be clear, none of this will happen on its own. It will require an extraordinary struggle against those who benefit so prodigiously from the status quo. And that's okay, right? Such a struggle has always been required of every movement that has ever changed the world, from the civil rights movement to the anti-colonial movements. These things don't just happen, right? It requires doing the hard work of community organizing, door to door, building solidarities and building alliances. And let me emphasize this point, right? The environmentalist movement cannot do this alone, okay? It's a misplaced hope. And this is true for two reasons. First, it does not have a sufficiently radical analysis. In most cases, it continues to think of the problem as having to do primarily with individual behavior, rather than the structure of the economic system, okay? Second, it does not have the political power that is required. Movements like Extinction Rebellion and Fridays for Future may be able to block bridges in central London, but they do not have the capacity to pull off something like a general strike, which is the kind of power that we need. So for this kind of action, environmentalists must build alliances with the labor movements and with the unions in particular. And this requires in turn that the unions change their own approach. Most unions have a tendency to align with the interests of capital in demanding more growth because they believe that growth is the only way to improve wages and employment. Instead, we need to unite around solving that problem more directly. Demand a shorter working week, demand living wages and the climate job guarantee. We must unite around these demands to bring working class formations on board and to liberate us to pursue the transition without worrying about the specter of unemployment. Okay, so this breaks the political logjam. It is also essential to build alliances across borders with anti-colonial movements in the global South. They are the ones with the necessary radical analysis. They are the ones with the real skin in the game. And they are the ones with the potential collective power to change the structure of the world economy, just as they did in the middle of the 20th century, at the apex of the anti-colonial struggle. This decade that we are in right now is the linchpin of history. We cannot just sit back and wait to see what happens. We need to build movements that are strong enough to either capture political power where possible, or otherwise to force incumbents to change course. So I'll leave it at that, and we'll go into questions. Thank you.
All right. Thanks so much, Jason, for that tour de force and for really piercing, some of the progressive veils that are out there that kind of make us think that we could be on the right track, but helping us realize that this is just recycled ways of hiding continued atmospheric colonization. And so I appreciate what you really outlining what needs to be done, and so I think we can open it up for the questions and discussion now. I'd like to start by asking Maxine, you were recently involved in the COP26 negotiations wearing a different hat. And I'm wondering, with your Harvard visiting professor hat, if you could just describe some of the outcomes there, the strengths, the successes, but also, where the limits of what was agreed to last month.
Yeah, thanks for that question. Happy to maybe provide some broad strokes, but I want to just first say that what Jason has shared is really critically important. One can imagine an Anthropocene defined by a different set of people producing a very different set of results in terms of what we'd be discussing right now. Just sort of underscoring that this is a function of systems that were sort of introduced and globalized, you know, from centuries of work and exploitation. And I think that is important to consider because the COP is never going to respond to that. So let me just sort of manage expectations here, right? What we have is a process that's meant to bring countries together to specifically reduce, attempt to reduce emissions and address its initial objective, which was to sort of avoid, dangerous interference with the climate system. We've reached that. In some ways, we've gone beyond the purpose of the convention itself, but the convention itself was meant to address what was a question of global political economy in one treaty in international environmental law, which was not sufficient. So just to kind of set expectations about what happened on its own terms, then maybe it was successful in many ways, which is to say that in the lead up to Glasgow was billed as what Paris promised Glasgow will deliver. In other words, Paris was setting up a new way for us to understand what our goals are and how we might get there. And it was setting up a process that was meant to, sort of continue to ratchet down emissions in a way that was consistent with not reaching the 2.2 degrees Celsius ceiling and aiming for 1.5. So that's really important as well, which is a little bit more devastating, which is to say that 1.5 was always still aspirational, even in the Paris context. But in Glasgow, what we saw were that in the run up to it, there was an attempt to really introduce new nationally determined contributions to put in place processes that would allow for those contributions to be considered over time and to be ratcheted down through processes each year. So in other words, we're meant to revisit, each country is meant to revisit their NDCs to see if it's consistent with, sort of the keeping 1.5 within reach. It was also an opportunity for announcements to be made that were consistent with the full suite of activities that contribute. So the global methane pledge was a big part of the informal outside of the negotiations, the informal ways in which we could address significant sources of emissions, methane being chief among them. We also saw for the first time a reference to fossil fuels in the decision, and believe it or not, 30 years in, that has never been explicitly referenced in a decision, and so it was included. There was some controversy towards the end around phasing out versus phasing down of fossil fuel use and coal in particular, but that was understood to be a really important introduction of the main driver in the agreement. So in terms of mitigation and emissions reductions, I think there was a lot of attention to that. There were also some advances in terms of adaptation support, but there are also very critical sticking points that continue, which is a big part of the conflict. And what I was demonstrating earlier in terms of the tensions at the negotiations tables around loss and damage, which are around really responding to the impacts of climate change and adequately. I think the posture has been, reducing emissions will avoid the worst impacts, and that's a way to address some of the things that loss and damage may introduce, some of the impacts that may be introduced. But we didn't quite get where we needed to be in that, and I think this next year is actually going to be the most important for understanding how we address issues of adaptation, loss, and damage. I think this next year will include a lot of dialogue. I know it will, the Glasgow dialogue, but leading up to COP27, it's a work in progress in these areas, and a lot of work needs to be done. I will just say as well that it is, again, important to consider the limitations of the process itself. And I will also underscore that the way we are addressing it is symptomatic of a deeper problem in international environmental law, which tends to be more surgical than systematic and systemic in its understanding or approach, and to sort of provide an additional sort of hue in terms of what Jason was describing. We have freighted environmentalism and environmental law with addressing some deeply foundational challenges, and it was never fit for purpose, right? I mean, the very fact that we have international environmental law, which is primarily, sort of is certainly anemic given the challenges, but is also not able to sort of fight back in the contest between international economic law and national environmental law. It's not able to do the work that it's saddled with, and we need to sort of contend with that as well. And in fact, in the sort of the legal academy, that's a conversation that I hope to have, which is to say, we should all be doing this work. This is not the work of environmental law. In fact, it shouldn't be. That it's much deeper than what we're seeing here. So. I'll pause there. I could say a ton more about Glasgow, but I really want to sort of zoom out and suggest that Glasgow is given more importance than it probably should be, given that so much more of this work has to happen everywhere else, including in Davos.
Yes, thank you. And we do love our surgeons in our department, but maybe not for environmental justice.
Metaphor.
So I see there's a question from Annabelle. Annabelle, would you like to ask directly?
Yeah, that's okay.
Okay, go ahead.
Yeah. So thank you very much for this talk and for the general overview and connecting all the dots. I was wondering that how do you approach people that might have the biggest influence? What language would you use instead of having all your efforts still hanging in the air? And secondly, are you familiar with Bertrand Russell's In Praise of Idleness?
Okay, thank you.
He's talking about this 40 the work weeks you're talking of, etc.
Mm-hmm. Yes, I mean, Maxine was on a reparations paper that we published where we thought we were putting out discourse and arguing for certain reparative actions, and a lot of what we received was hate mail and threats in return. And so it is a good question of how do you frame things? How do you change the discourse when in an environment of culture wars?
But so far what would they be receptive to? How could you upgrade their receptors and prevent them from down-regulating their receptors? But in my view, even their wealth doesn't make them more smiley or more happy or whatever, but are still blunt to the usual arguments. So somehow there needs to be a button that will address them as well as the goal for the global population. How come we haven't found it yet? And how would we, or could we?
Should I jump in here, Gene?
Yeah.
Okay, so yeah, first of all, yes, Bertrand Russell, excellence. And this actually reveals an important point, which is the question of how to address unemployment has actually been solved about 100 years ago, right? Like we know how to do it. You shorten the working week and distribute necessary labor more fairly, rather than inducing the perpetual scarcity of the perpetual artificial scarcity of unemployment, right? And this is remarkable. It's remarkable that our politicians continue to say that growth is required to end unemployment, right? And yet every year, despite our growth, there's always more unemployment, right? It's a complete fabrication, but somehow we buy into this narrative that growth is going to solve this problem. It's not. It's not designed to. In a capitalist economy, productivity increases generate unemployment, okay? And Keynes himself, nearly 100 years ago now, was very clear. Like, what you do to solve this problem is you shorten the working week. So you take the gains of productivity increases in the form of more free time. So this problem can be solved very easily without growth. And this brings me to address the second question, which has to do with narratives. Look, I think that the question of growth is ultimately, this is a deeply ideological terrain, right? Think of the word growth. It sounds so positive, right? Children grow, plants grow, Jean's hair grows, which is amazing. And, we grow in knowledge and maturity and so on, right? So it sounds so positive. Why? Of course we want the economy to grow. It sounds so good, right? But in reality, what is growth? We have to be very clear about what actually growth is about. We assume that growth is about increasing provisioning or well-being or use values, right? No, it's not. It's specifically in a capitalist economy about increasing production in order to, and specifically commodity production, so commodified goods and services, not things like public healthcare and public transportation, in order to extract a profit, right? And in order to extract a rising profit. And of course, this entails all sorts of destructive forces of extraction and exploitation and so on, which we might want to reject, but then this is packaged in the language of growth, which gets us to buy into things that we otherwise might object to, right? And so all of us go around, despite being victims of growthism, also calling for more growth. It's like the perfect ideological word. It gets the working classes to buy into a project that is not in their interest, but rather is in the interest of a small elite. Okay, so we have to fight on this ideological terrain as well, and point out what growth is really about, why it's destructive, and why we need something different. And I think this is the word that something like degrowth or post-growth does. I realize it can be jarring for people who have been like who are enamored of the language and the imagery, but that's exactly what we have to sort of work past. And that's hard work, but it needs to be done so that we can imagine an economy that is in fact organized around meeting human needs rather than organized around expansion and accumulation, which is the way our existing economy is organized. Because there's simply no way, it is literally impossible for us to solve the ecological crisis with an economy that's organized around expansion and elite accumulation. It's not going to happen. And so we need to be able to shift away from that.
Thank you, Annabelle and Jason. I see Arthur, your hand is up, please.
I enjoyed this presentation very much, both presentations. I thought they were excellent. And I'd like to stimulate a discussion between both discussants, because I felt that Maxine, as a lawyer, properly pointed toward the kind of political issues which I feel Jason, as in really I see as an idealist, but an idealist with a wonderful vision, fails to address. And so at the end of Jason's thing, we get the nice statement, what are the next steps? And then the next step is going to be an international strike and a global strike and a revolution. Come on, not going to happen. The working class in America is going right, not left. So we need political steps. We need political steps to get from the issues that were beautifully presented by Maxine and the ideal scenario that Jason terrifically endorses and extends. And so that's the question I'd like you to address together. What are those, how do we translate this into pragmatic, critical pragmatism, which brings political steps that can actually lead to getting to where we'd like to go?
Jason, do you want to go first, or I'm happy to?
If you want to start, go for it. I can.
Okay.
I can follow.
Okay. So thanks for the question. I will say, I mean, a lot of what I have witnessed will underscore, I think, what you're suggesting, which is that we need to really think about our audience here, at least in the US context. So even terms like degrowth will grate in a way that will be challenging potentially. Though I will say this is probably generational. And what I will ultimately say is that I Jason, what he's describing is a North Star, and I think that there are specific ways we can get there. And I also, frankly, think that while a global strike that is intentional and is as widespread may be difficult to imagine, I think the climate crises will inspire it, if you will. We're going to see the kinds of disruptions. I think what we talk about, so even the discussion of like what the world looks like at 3 degrees is completely mythical. We have no idea what that looks like. And in fact, I think we won't get there largely because we can't get there because of the impacts of climate. We are seeing the level of disruption that will force these events in ways that, again, may seem idealistic and off sort of off the charts in terms of plausibility, but actually I think circumstances may force some things that we haven't imagined yet. And so in that moment, I think of disruption, we will be looking at approaches like degrowth in a way that are emancipatory in their own light. But I will say, right now, we have a scenario in which no one is certainly at the negotiations table is talking about this kind of future. In fact, it's the reverse. It's much more comfortable. It is meant to help us feel less frightened about it. It is a bit of anesthesia there in that space. And when we think about the politics of it, it's important to also recognize that some of even the negotiators, I would say, are sympathetic to these positions, but understand that when we come back to the United States, it's a non-starter. Like you're saying, at least the white working class is moving to the right, and this is an important space for us to think about how we can find language, cultural vouchers, and the kinds of politics that will appeal and disruption that will appeal to the language that is comfortable for that group in the moment. And so what I mean by that is there were members of the House, the Republican members that were in Glasgow, and their response was we need absolutely free markets to address the climate crisis. And in fact, it's the sort of the notions of the left that are trapping us in this like horrible climate future. There's obviously a narrative there that needs to be addressed on its own terms. I will also say that I think we don't have time for this, or I think the work is allowing for more time for this generation, the younger generation, to be able to tease out some of these issues. And I don't mean to speak so generally in an abstract fashion, but with the other hat that I wear, it's really important to sort of underscore that we see that what's currently possible may not be what is possible even 5 or 10 years from now. But we do need to be mindful of it in the interim. So I'll pause there and turn it over to Jason, but say that I think that our work is more aligned than it seems, and that what I'm looking at is how we have the types of language and conversations that are fit for the communities to which we need to be addressing them.
Yeah, thanks, Maxine, and thank you, Arthur. I've read your work, and so it's wonderful to see your name and hear your voice here. So yeah, I mean, a few things to say, I suppose. The first is that I'm not a political strategist. That's not my area of expertise. So like in my work, in my empirical work, what I do is I model plausible, feasible trajectories for staying under 1.5 degrees by shifting the way that our economies work, right? And it's clear this is sort of the kind of shift that's required for us to reverse ecological breakdown and to stop and to keep climate change under 1.5 degrees. Whether or not we can pull that off is a political question. I don't have a good answer to that. I'll note, however, that's like even Maxine's claims, right, about reparations, which I support wholeheartedly. I mean, this is not part of the mainstream discourse. There's nobody who's yet on board with this, and yet we have to make that happen, right? So yeah, idealistic, but also necessary, I suppose, the way I see it. Now, it's not clear to me that something like degrowth in the global north is something that our existing arrangement of power in our governments is going to voluntarily adopt, unless they're somehow pushed from below or from outside. And so this is why I rely on historical precedent of something like the civil rights movement or the anti-colonial struggle, which are the only examples we have of substantial effective change in the way that that systems run on a broad scale, right? And the anti-colonial movement in particular, I mean, we cannot underestimate their success in utterly transforming the logic and structure of the world economy, even though it was overturned by structural adjustments. Okay. Now, as far as where is the movement that could accomplish this? That is a hard question. So the movement is required. Where is it? This is a hard question because, and it's true for the South as well as for the North. In the South, we do not have the same alignments of political forces that existed in the immediate post-colonial decades that were capable of challenging Northern economic interests successfully. These days, there's a proliferation of kind of neoliberals in the governments of the global South. And so we rely instead on global South social movements, right? Which were represented on the fringes of Glasgow and which are growing in their power. And I think that what we need to do is align with them as much as possible. In the global North, the US is a difficult case because, as you point out, Arthur, the white working class is moving to the right. And I see this actually as an effect of American capitalism, right? The left has effectively not offered an alternative to that system. Instead, they line up behind capitalist growth. And in order to sustain capitalist growth, you have to somehow depress the costs of labor and resources, be that through imperialist interventions, or be it through immiserating your own domestic working class. And the US has chosen the latter, the former and the latter, but including the latter, for the past 40 years through domestic neoliberalism, immiserating the working class, right? And the only way that they can sustain that politically is by at the same time feeding them the narrative that they're better than, at least they're better off than their even more immiserated compatriots in the global South and people of color in the global North, right? And so as long as the working class can align, the white working class can align somehow with the identity of the ruling class, they're willing to accept their immiseration politically. I mean, Trump was a master of this, right? And so the left is the progressives, the Democrats are incapable of providing an alternative to this, right? Until you're able to challenge the structural machinations of capital accumulation, you cannot offer an alternative. You cannot effectively take the question of livelihoods off the table by solving that problem directly, right? And so this is exactly what we need. The kind of policies I'm calling for would allow the working class to get on board with the post-growth agenda and allow us to achieve a just climate transition. And that's why the social policies that I call for are essential here, because without those, you don't get the kind of political buy-in that we need. And I'll just close by saying I think that's Maxine is exactly right, that the next 10 years will change the game in terms of what is politically thinkable, because the planet we're headed towards is not a happy one.
Thank you, Arthur. So we have about 8 minutes left. I'd like to ask Paul if you could give a few comments, and then we'll get to Anahi's question to finish off.
Well, I have a question too, but I just wanted to add to Jason's list of the civil rights movements and the movements for formal colonial rule. We might want to add, and by the way, Jason, as an aside, I really appreciate you reminding us that there were very many positive things that happened in that interlude before the rise of structural adjustment programs. And you'll remember that Jim Kim led this project, that it was 20 years ago that we wrote a book called Dying for Growth, in which a bunch of people focused either on health and well-being, really tried to get a handle on what we might do and how we understand this. But to add to that list, and Ophelia Dahl is on the line, and she texted me this. She reminded me of Bury the Chains, the book by Adam Hochschild, about the abolition movement largely in the UK. And as you point out, Jason, no movement like that ever succeeds without being pushed from the South. And the contemporaneous push, the only example of successful manumission is the Haitian Revolution. And these were happening at the same time. But it's worth remembering, that the uptake among the British working class of the abolition movement was robust, fairly robust. I mean, he wrote in there that the majority of the population of the city of Manchester signed on to the Sugar Boycott. And again, you're going to remember this book even better than I do. And I mentioned that resonance because the abolition movement that was echoed by those seeking to break their own chains did lead to something. It didn't lead to the abolition of slavery. That only happened really in Haiti, but to the abolition of the slave trade. And that ambivalence, again, gave us many decades of instability that led to the US Civil War and other major conflicts. Anyway, I'm just thinking about the organizing challenge that you put before us, Jason, and those events, which may inspire some. And I guess my question, which is going to sound awfully academic, given the gravity and the eloquence of those two presentations, and I am going to say one thing, Gene, that I have been working with you both for 2 years, and I still found these talks both instructive and alarming in their details, and I learned a great deal that I kind of thought that I knew, but did not. And since we're in the Department of Social Medicine, and since social medicine is supposed to be a rubric that would contain not just environmentalism, but real environmental justice movements, and one might well imagine a comfort with degrowthism. We are, as the first questioner mentioned, we are though living in a time where it seems like growthism as a world religion is quite strong. Even in these catastrophic circumstances, we see so many countries in the global South still signing on to growthism. In fact, you can point, but perhaps to a few that aren't, but the ones that we're working in, the badly ecologically damaged ones, Malawi, which I believe you mentioned, Lesotho, Sierra Leone, Liberia. Sierra Leone, for example, in 2013, had the world's highest GDP growth rate. And within 1 year of the start of the Ebola epidemic, it was up just one from the bottom above Yemen only. So that we have so much data that corroborates the analyses that you both advance. And for some of us, alarmed as we should be, we're still kind of feel stuck, and therefore the optimism that both of you managed to infuse at the end of your commentaries is cause for optimism, because you're seeing movements that maybe we don't see as well either from the United States, but even from Rwanda, which has put a huge fraction of its budget into health and education, which has a fairly, I'd like to hear what Maxine has to say, but is at least a fairly public commitment to, that's why we're sitting here right now, and in this university focused on planetary health and global health equity. One of the couple texts that I got during this is, given the analysis, which really leads straight only to policy and organizing, what are some of the buttons that we should be trying to push more within medicine? And we've heard about some from law. And like law, which Maxine characterized as structurally complicit, medicine has to be seen that way too, if in different ways. So what are some of the things that, it's not fair, I know, for me to ask you two, what are some of the things we might do? But how about if I qualify that by saying inside of medicine, public health, and the health and social justice movements, the more progressive parts of global health equity? Do you have any instructions for us? Where should we be leaning harder? All of us are probably involved in one way or the other in supporting environmental justice. What might some of us do as academics, the citizenry? Again, that seems like an unfair question unless we bound it, and I'm just saying within medicine.
Thanks, Paul. I believe you're actually late for grand rounds, so I'm going to bundle your question.
Sorry.
I'm going to bundle your question with Anahi's. See you later.
By the way, for those who have asked, Carol lets us know that we could have this available by January 10th. The holidays coming up. Thank you so much, Gene, for
Yeah.
making me wait.
All right.
Paul.
Nahi, could you ask your question? Because I think bundling what we can do with what we can learn from indigenous knowledge that has already had solutions to this for thousands of years, as Jason has written eloquently about. If you wouldn't mind just asking your questions, and then we'll get some quick final thoughts from our two speakers. I've enabled you, but I can just read it. Thank you very much for this enlightening presentation. Go ahead.
Hi. Oh, sorry. I did hear a little bit of you talking about the place of indigenous people, indigenous ideologies, and cosmovisions in these goals, but I just didn't know if you had more thoughts. I could expand a little bit more about how this ancestral ideologies and ancestral ways of being could push us forward towards these this degrowth and environmental justice work.
I can hop in and here just to sort of tie these two together. Two big questions, and especially Paul's in terms of how we might think about engaging more. And I'll just say a bit about the structural complicity piece. I think we've all struggled from the tendency, I think this being a byproduct, a long-standing byproduct of the European Enlightenment, to compartmentalize the environment in ways that aren't consistent, and actually goes to some of the questions around indigenous worldviews and how that would change the way we think about the problem. But suffice it to say, we compartmentalize environment and environmental impacts in significant ways in the law. We did attempt to address it in this one space, as I've mentioned, and then we fragment those spaces. So water doesn't have anything to do with air, it doesn't have anything to do with sort of land, and that tends to sort of commitment to a legal taxonomy tends to hamper, again, our ability to diagnose the problem and then to address it appropriately. I suspect the same is happening in medicine. And in fact, a lot of the work of this department is, from what I've learned from the prior webinars, et cetera, is to sort of break down those the ways in which health is compartmentalized from other elements of, again, where you live, work, and play, which is literally the environmental justice definition of environment, where you live, work, and play. And so all of those spaces being healthy will matter for your own personal health. Just one quick anecdote is that when I was talking to colleagues in the law school in California, of all places, about why this environment needs to be sort of liberated from its confined space in the curriculum, and that tracks with where it's confined in our political structures at all scales. The argument back to me was, well, I can't imagine my bankruptcy colleague teaching about climate change, for example. And this was after the massive fires with PG&E and the bankruptcy process that it went through. And they were saying, well, wouldn't we think that the lawyers for PG&E would have benefited from knowing that they are actually practicing in an environment that is under stress? And so I would suggest that I don't have specific instructions for how medicine per se, you all would know that, would do this better. I mean, I have some thoughts as an external observer, but the first step is to, again, sort of liberate your notions of what the environment is and what it has to do with your work. That's an unfortunate sort of habit, I think, intellectual habit that we have, which is not to sort of incorporate that more holistically. And again, I would say, just from some of the writing I've done and the research and living in Hawaii and certainly being in the Pacific, to the second question, without essentializing, there are differences in the way it manifests, but indigenous worldviews tend to take a long view. We are a part of, we are not defending nature, we are nature defending itself. We are part of our ecosystems. We have, our growth is healthy growth until it's not, until it's more viral in a negative way. And so if we understand that as a way of thinking about the world, we can see how we get the big ideas down to sort of the specific policies. And to the earlier question, that's our work. We get the great information from people like Jason, and then the work is for lawyers and policymakers to make sure it can actually do the job. And great examples of that, specific examples of that, would be in Aotearoa in New Zealand, where you see that the rights of nature have been sort of woven into their jurisprudence. The Whanganui River was given personhood, if you will, so that it could sort of fight for its own rights in terms of its health and its free flowing. But similarly, instead of trying to even sort of manage to get indigenous worldviews into a sort of common law structure that was descending from Britain, they've also used Maori again, the worldview as it represents itself in jurisprudence to manage state parks, and that management looks different. And at the same time, in the transition, the world didn't fall apart in Aotearoa. In the introduction of these indigenous approaches, there hasn't been the kinds of threats that you see in the concerns about introducing those worldviews into actual actionable policy. And we're seeing that in the international space as well. It's the beginning, but the Framework Convention on Climate Change has the local communities and indigenous peoples platform. That is a recognition of the fact that even though the indigenous peoples are 6% of the world population, 80% of biodiversity is on the lands that they steward. There's an acknowledgement of that, but there's also an acknowledgement of the fact that that information, that knowing, it needs to be engaged with in a very respectful way. And we need to understand how it can happen at scale. But I think these are sort of hopeful signs in terms of what the next set of conversations will look like.
Thank you, Maxine. We've extended for 10 minutes, so we just have a few left. Jason, could you give us some final thoughts, please?
Yeah, I'll just be very brief. So I think that one quick point of clarification is that we argue for degrowth in the global north, and in the global south, this is not required. We argue for a post-growth transition, so a shift in development policy away from growthism as an objective and towards rather human well-being. Now that dimension is very clearly articulated in indigenous scholarship from Latin America in particular, under the rubric of Buen Vivir, or Sumit Kase, which has basically been a longstanding critique of Western development discourse in favor of a kind of a well-being approach, right, that integrates ecological dimensions as well. So, post-growth scholarship, which is now a massive academic scholarship, draws very heavily on these inspirations. The second thing to say is that clearly, in order to stop climate breakdown, we have to actively scale down fossil fuel use in rich nations, in particular. And so far, the only movements that are effective at achieving that have been indigenous movements that have obstructed and closed down fossil fuel infrastructure. Okay, so Standing Rock is obviously the big example, but the Environmental Justice Atlas, which you can see online, run by the Autonomous University of Barcelona, has documented hundreds of cases where social movements, and particularly indigenous movements, have shut down fossil fuel infrastructure. They've made a bigger contribution to stopping emissions than all the climate agreements combined, right? So that's amazing. This shows you the power of social movements here, and again, specifically indigenous ones. And then finally, to Paul's question, I think the key thing to recognize here is simply this: that to the extent, as I've demonstrated in my talk, that growth in the global north depends on imperialist appropriation from the south, this has a direct negative consequence on health outcomes. And we can see that very directly by looking at, say, look at energy. I showed net appropriation of energy from the south to the north. Now we know that energy has a relationship with human well-being and health outcomes. We can model that directly. So we can tell exactly how much the south has lost in terms of potential health outcomes because of the appropriation of their energy for the sake of global north growth, okay? So this kind of thing should enter into our discourse, right? Like, we have this assumption that growth always yields sort of better health outcomes. No, it also has outsourced negative health impacts, specifically to the global south. And this should be part of our analysis. And the more we can demonstrate this, I think empirically, this becomes quite important politically as well.
Well, sorry, we're out of time, so we can get to the last few questions. For the anonymous attendee who asked about, should Harvard be scaling down their monopoly on knowledge? Yes, some of it, we also work together on, not just what environmental justice looks like, but what epistemic injustice looks like, and how places like Harvard contribute to interpretations of the world that actually reproduce these neo-colonial extractive regimes. So I'll point you to some of that work out there, or just send me an email. But I'd like to say thanks so much to our brilliant speakers. It was great to have you today, and we look forward to working with you in the future. Thanks to everybody in attendance. And this will be available in the next few weeks online to share. So thanks again.
Thanks very much, Gene. Thanks, Maxine.
Thank you both. Really wonderful.